Law Alliance. Hope you all had a good week. We have got plenty of stuff to get through today, so I'm just going to dive right in with the questions. Welcome, Silna, Bruno, and Greg. Welcome back again. First of all, I think the question on everyone's mind is, tomorrow is the last official day of the 35-day lockdown, and we are now going out of level 5 into level 4. What exactly does this level 4 mean? How does this affect people moving in and out of their properties? Maybe Silna, you could start us off with this one.
Yes, so thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you for hosting us again. I hope everybody is having a fabulous Wednesday. I think as much as we know tomorrow is the sort of last day of lockdown, everybody's sharing different emotions around the end of lockdown, because as much as we think, oh yay, end of lockdown, and we thought when we get to that point, we're all going to run out of our houses and braai with our friends. And the truth is, it's still lockdown, but at least now you have visitors sort of still over Zoom, because nothing changed that much. And I think it's actually in a way important for us to have these conversations, especially in a time like this, where as much as we all think, brilliant, this is the end of lockdown, I think we've all got to appreciate the fact that this is not truly the end of lockdown. It's lockdown light, but not even light. It's like lockdown light, but still with enough kick to it. And just before we started, Rowan, Bruno, Greg, and I had a conversation about how differently we are experiencing this situation. And I think if we talk to each other, every hour is a different emotion. You think, oh goodness, I'm out, everything's going to be fine. And the next moment you think, oh my goodness, no, I'm not actually out, I'm so frustrated. So it's interesting emotions to deal with. So to answer your question, after a very long story, as much as there's a lot of tenants, purchasers, sellers that are desperate to move from their properties, at this very minute where we sit right now, we do not know whether tenants will be able to move or not. The main reason for this is we do not have formal regulations. Remember, the breakdown of what's happening in each level isn't regulations. It was a suggestion that was put out, that was published, where they asked for public commentary, which we've done. I know for a fact, I've made submissions. Greg, I know you've made submissions. Bruno, I'm quite sure you've made submissions. So we've all made our submissions, and I need to make it clear that we didn't do this as the Property Law Alliance. We've done it as in our individual firms or as part of other groups. And the reason why I'm stating this is we had to bring a united front from the property industry so government can see that we all need the same thing. So as much as we would like to give you an answer today on if people can move or not, the answer is from the regulations where we are sitting with, probably not. So I wouldn't start backing if I was a tenant, unless there are very specific permits, weird arrangements, actual true permits that will allow you to move. Until we have the regulations, which we will probably only have tomorrow, we can't recommend anything other than people should sit tight until we have regulations.
Just to briefly touch, add to that, one of the questions that I was asked yesterday, especially by Airbnb hosts, specifically around whether people are allowed to move on the 1st. And again, it's best to wait until tomorrow. But some of these people, the unfortunate thing is certain essential service providers are looking for accommodation because now they can get back to work. And they're approaching Airbnb sometimes to ask, listen, but now can I move in with you during this period of time? So as an Airbnb host, you should be very careful. Now, I understand you don't want to leave it last minute, but the reality is we don't know what the regulations are. So you can't just agree to it only to realize later that it's not going to happen. But a consideration that I had was if it is for an essential service provider, it may be warranted in those circumstances, and I think it is in terms of the framework and the level and I think the regulations to allow these people to move in. provided that they can show that they're essential service providers. But again, rather wait until tomorrow, but you may want to already start engaging these persons. Just leave a little room for mistake.
Bruno,
What I'm hoping, sorry.
Now go,
Carry on,
go
Sona.
on. I
was
just
just
want
going
to
to
ask
say,
Bruno a question.
go for it.
This is attorneys, guys. This is what it looks like. Bruno, I just want to ask you something about Airbnb. I'm sorry, Ro, now I'm taking your hosting rights away. Bruno, I've seen I've seen on Airbnb's site that they are referring to Airbnbs made available for self-isolation. So now at this stage in South Africa, obviously, with the number of cases we have, we're not there yet. Please note my term, get there. We might very well get there. Do you have any clarity on what is happening for Airbnb hosts to be allowed to use their premises for self-isolation purposes?
Look, I don't have a precise answer on that, but as far as I'm aware, it is allowed. It can be used, because if I recall correctly, in terms of the framework, the accommodation providers can be utilized for self-isolation. I would have to specifically ask the question, but I don't see any reason why it can't be.
Thank you. Okay, Greg, now I'll keep quiet.
No problem. What I was going to say is that, well as the government has done, and it has done well, they can't know all the minutiae of every industry. And I think 40% of the workforce swing into action in one way or another come Friday. And we will know that there's a percentage implication on accommodation, essential or otherwise. And I'm hoping that as a result of the representations made, the government will recognize that there is a fundamental reality of unlocking 40% of the workforce, which will include that they will need a place to live. So I'm hoping that will be acknowledged in the new regulations tomorrow.
Fantastic. And then also there's another question about student accommodation. So obviously during this time, a lot of students have actually moved back home to their parents, and now those premises are just sitting empty, but they've signed an entire lease agreement from January to, let's say, November, December of 2020. What would be your recommendation for landlords in this respect? For Bruno, sorry, if you could maybe.
So one needs to distinguish between the NSFAS students and basically the cash market. So the guys that enter into lease agreements, or their parents enter into lease agreements, because these are being dealt with completely differently. So in terms of the NSFAS model, these are accredited residences, and the universities actually issued regulations out to these service providers that they need to empty these residences out. So theoretically, these should be empty. And yes, a few students did stay behind because they might not have a place to go back to. But for the most part, there is no one at these residences. And the university has now issued strict protocol that people shouldn't actually be allowed back. And there's obviously this, because they issued protocol as to when the university was going to open, but that obviously didn't happen. So as it stands at the moment, no one should actually be going back to these residences, especially because they're very close quarters and there's a lot of shared amenities there. So theoretically, as a landlord, I would probably advise that a notice be issued to say that, unfortunately, the lockdown does not permit this type of movement and re-entry into the premises. But the one benefit is the NSFAS students are being paid by NSFAS. And the last I spoke to my clients, this hadn't been an issue. And there were a few payment anomalies where there were delays in some of the payments being released. For example, there were some issues with data capturing. So some of the students hadn't been loaded up on the system properly, which caused a couple of issues. So I'm not saying that it's easier for these clients from the cash flow perspective, but you are almost guaranteed to receive those payments from NSFAS, which is one of the benefits. In the cash market, that's slightly different though, because there you're looking at a normal buy-to-let contract. And the same principles that we apply to buy-to-let, we're going to apply here. The only differences, for example, would be with specifically shared spaces, because in these shared spaces now, you as a landlord, the question is, does the landlord now have an obligation to take care of these students? And unfortunately, my answer to that, especially in the current circumstances, is yes, to a certain degree. I wouldn't, one does need to be careful. Yes, each student should be responsible for themselves, but because there's certain things that one student cannot do to prevent another student from interacting with him, the landlord does almost need to step in as the authority in that specific space. So for example, sanitizers, everything that we're speaking about in the workplace, so hand sanitizers, general social distancing rules, that sort of thing, should actually be applied to these premises at the moment. And a very important element is new guys, or sorry, not new guys, but students that had decided to leave the premises and now want to return. I would tell those landlords that they need to deal with that very seriously. And my suggestion would be to issue a notice out informing them that they can't return during the lockdown because travel's not allowed, to the degree where they even say that if they were to return and try enter the premises, the landlord may not have any option but to contact the authorities, and kind of let the landlord step away from it and let them contact the authorities, because at least then they're kind of passing the buck onto people that can actually handle it. But at the very least, issue maybe that notice out so then people don't land up at your doorstep trying to get in. Does that answer the entire question? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it does. It does. So this would also be similar to a scenario of, for instance, a person who left their province at the beginning, just before lockdown, to go and spend lockdown with family in another province, and now they're, due to the no one is able to travel between provinces, they're now stuck. What would be your recommendation for someone in this kind of situation? Because now they've there's nothing that they can really do during this time and for the foreseeable future, because no one knows exactly when level 4 exactly is going to be decreased to a level 3. What would be, I mean, any of you, if you have any advice or recommendation,
I'll give
or
somebody
just get
else
a discussion going. Yeah.
But this is the anomaly with what appears to be the current prediction, because people are going back to work on Friday. People in what are deemed to be level 4 categories, which aren't essential, all of them, but they are, they've been deemed to be capable of opening up. Now, many of those people, I had a friend the other day who had to move from one province to the other. He got the authority and he came through. So what are we to do as landlords? We must accommodate them. So the regulations have to permit that. And if they don't, quite frankly, they are wrong.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree with your point there, Greg. It's going to be, I think, to try and find a blanket answer on what do you do if you're stuck in a province. It depends on exactly that. If you're a level 4 person that should go back, yes, get the authority. And I agree with you, Greg. It would be a nonsensical to have somebody allowed to work, but then he can't travel to his work. That would be silly. But at the same time, I mean, there are people stuck in provinces that can't travel across the province borders, but it's not for level 4 type things. It's because of a frustration situation. And I think in those situations, the only answer there would be, guys, we're going to have to stay calm for a bit longer. But to your point, Greg, if you are a level 4 person that would have to travel across province, I would like to see the regulations specifically make provision for that.
They must do. I mean, look, the question, surely if someone has authority to cross province, they have authority to travel. So they actually have something they can show you as a landlord, and you can admit them. Absolutely. The bigger difficulty is, what if someone lives in Hammanskraal and their work is opening up and they have to move to a new place of residence or an old place of residence? These are realities. They don't need a permit to move from Hammanskraal to Johannesburg, but they have as much right to work on the assumption it's been given under level 4 as anyone else. And therefore, in my view, they must be able to be accommodated. But the government isn't stupid. They've demonstrated great capacity up to now, and I'm sure that they will recognize this.
No, I have to agree. Yeah, I have to agree with that. I see that most of the framework does deal with support of level 4 persons. So a lot of it turns on that. So I can't see, and I mean, even from an accommodation perspective, they said that things like hotels shouldn't be operating unless it's for isolation. And so I can't see how one wouldn't allow, in support of level 4 persons, accommodations to open up. And something that Silna pointed out that's very true is we're having two categories. The same question about moving tenants comes from two different types of persons. The one is the frustrated person, the person that doesn't have the budget to pay rent anymore, or the landlord that wants tenants to move out and wants the new tenants to move in. And then the other ones are the essential guys that need to actually start getting back to the real, to daily life. And unfortunately, those also need to be treated differently. These ones are more than likely going to be accepted as permissible. The ones for budget, the ones just out of frustration, unfortunately, during level 4, I highly doubt it. But yeah, we're going to see.
Yes, I agree with
that. We must remember that 40% of the economy starts on Friday. That is not an insignificant number. There are, every single one of those people will have a real life issue, and a percentage of them will have a real life accommodation issue. But yeah, let's see. Regulations should deal with this. And what we've seen is they're quite quick to amend those regulations if they're not fit for purpose. So even if there isn't something in tomorrow, we could probably, the real life implications will dawn, and we will see potential amendments within days.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Greg, to your point, I think we just need to take a second here to appreciate the irony in all of this. On Freedom Day, we were all not free. On Workers' Day, where we're supposed to take a public holiday to not work, we're all like, can we work, please? Can we work? I mean, the irony in all of this, if we don't appreciate that, we're going to miss this.
I remember the 80s, unlike you guys, you were younger, and it's not amusing to me at all.
I can imagine by now. We only arrived in the 80s. We were like, yeah.
I know.
While we are on the discussion of work, obviously there's going to be a lot more workers going back to work. This more goes to the commercial aspects of the property industry. A lot of commercial tenants have been enforcing the legal principle of supervening impossibility. That's because they can't get to work, they don't have to pay their rental, which, like we discussed last week, is not a correct idea to rely on during this time. How will now, with people going back to work and being able to, well, obviously certain aspects of the industry going back to work, how will this affect people relying on this legal principle?
That's a very interesting one. It's specifically because it was addressed by the president. I can't even remember the day. I've lost count. I think we're on day 34. But way back when lockdown was extended, and the president said, guys, please don't rely on the smile or intervening possibilities. Suddenly, Rowan, to your question, when people are, Greg, you said 40%. When 40% of the economy is starting to fire up again, suddenly that potential defense somebody had or right he had to enforce to get away from his obligations potentially, which the president politely asked not to enforce, suddenly that does go away. Once again, depending on the industry. And Greg, you rightly say that level 4 is potentially a very wide thing. So the principle of intervening impossibility, wow, that went so south. The smile there. If you can't by law definitely show that you can't operate, but you choose not to. And I think just a conversation the three of us had before we started, how are we going to deal with our firms? I, for instance, have decided, even if we can, I'm going to try and keep my people working from home as far as I can. Once again, my practice looks very different to yours, for instance, Greg, where you need your people in the office. So the fact that I choose not to use my premises, I believe that takes the legal limitation away for me I can't tell my landlord I'm not going to pay my rent because I choose to have my people work remotely. I think it does bring a big change, Rowan, and I think what we've been saying all along is we don't want landlords or tenants to just blindly enforce their rights. We want people to be considerate of each other, even if you're potentially not able to use your premises, but you still have a form of revenue coming in. Is it really reasonable to not pay your landlord anything? What we want to see is the communication between landlords and tenants to find middle ground. Once again, very different between the different types of landlords and tenants. Your high-tech building kind of guys isn't going to come and have a conversation over a cup of coffee and a Zoom conversation with the landlord, where my typical kind of client, the landlord might have a bit of more flexibility when it comes to not receiving rent. And at the same time, the tenant is the type of person that will hop into a conversation with the landlord, and they can find middle ground. So I think what I'm saying is there's really not a simple answer, because every situation is so extremely unique.
But Bruno, would I be right in saying that a residential occupier can't even begin to use force majeure as a defense? It would only apply to a commercial occupier, and quite frankly, if he's got a desk or a piece of paper, you are storing his goods. Sorry, no defense of force majeure there, I'm afraid. And certainly I agree with Silna. A lot of retail, quite a few of my inner city clients have retail components to their properties, and much of that retail can start again. So that owner can trade. If you can trade, don't even try a defense of force majeure, because that will definitely fail.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I agree with that. So what I've seen from the research that I've done is the extent of use does come into play to a certain degree. So to just confirm what you said, so residential versus commercial, very different. Residential, you're using the property, you're enjoying it. Objectively speaking, you can pay rent because it's an actual act of payment. So there shouldn't be any issue with that. With residential, with commercial, obviously the issue being the landlord not being able to allow you to use the premises. So now the use is gone, and that reciprocal duty is also obviously there's a measure of, or a certain extent where you cannot use the property. So if one now starts looking at like a pro rata remission, it is an important conversation to have. You are right about the fact that there are servers on the property. The property, for a lot of times, it's still being occupied to a certain degree. There's a lot of furniture, security. A lot of the buildings actually have security guards there, an actual monthly expenditure. So the bottom line is, you as a tenant should actually still be contributing towards your rent. But the argument is, if you're not using it for the full purpose that you entered into the lease for, there might be an argument to say that there should be a slight remission, and the extent of the remission would obviously depend on the level of usage.
Bruno, if on that point, I'm enjoying Greg's disagreement there, and I think it's a valid point. I think it is something that we can't agree on specifically, because it can't be the same. Once again, our specific kind of clients are very different. And I think the answer is unique. But Bruno, my question is actually, say for instance, this the regulations now doesn't allow interprovincial travel, obviously, unless it's for work purposes. Say theoretically, on this conversation, a residential tenant now is stuck in Limpopo. He's not allowed to come back to Gauteng, and he's been hanging out with family. So by law, it's impossible for him to use the premises that he's renting. Wouldn't Vismail come into play there, or is this, am I opening a very big can of worms here?
So we had this, you and I had this conversation at a stage. It's a very interesting one, and I'm worried about it because This was completely speculative, but my thought behind that question was, when the lockdown came into effect, the tenant made an election. By making an election, he could have stayed at the residence and enjoyed occupation, but he chose not to. So it wasn't by law that he wasn't allowed onto the premises. He could have stayed there. So within that, as soon as that happens, my argument is, you're supposed to be paying rent. I'm sorry, you made a choice. Our argument, or the contention came in when there was an extension to the lockdown, that kind of changed things, because that election now became moot. The election no longer applied, because the election was based on knowledge of a 3-week lockdown without any realization of an extension. And I mean, a lot of us got caught by, oh, it's 21 days. We can survive 21 days. I mean, you should look at my alcohol stockpile. 21 days was it. It's gone.
Sorry, Bruno. We feel for you.
Like a little bit of gin left and that's it.
Pineapple sales have gone up 900%.
Greg will send you a recipe.
I'm from the Eastern Cape. We don't need recipes. We're born knowing how to brew it.
And there's moonlighting happening by all the neighbors where they're selling alcohol over the walls. It's crazy. But the reality is we only provisioned it. We only provisioned lockdown for 3 weeks. So the question comes in, does the extension now act as some sort of intervening act that took that option away? And now the person that can't move into the property by law cannot move into the property. Is that not in itself now almost a new act of vis majeure, which would then entitle that tenant to a remission of rent from the period of extension?
But that's new tenants. Hey, Bruno, that's new tenants.
No, so to be existing tenants who chose to move during the initial lockdown, but now want to come back but can't, and they never realized that there was going to be an extension. So during the first period, I argue that rent would be payable, but during the second period, there could be an argument to say that at that stage, vis majeure kicks in, because now they can't actually move back, and it wasn't out of their own choice. They can't. They're not allowed to.
It's interesting.
Is there stuff in your property?
What's that?
Is there stuff in your property?
Yeah, there would be.
Okay.
Occupation.
You in, you got a lease, you pay rent, end of.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. But you obviously, I think of the three of us, you're going to be the first one back in court. I see an urgent coming for you before the.
No, we've been in court this week already, even on non-urgent stuff.
See, I was right. But if there is a case like that coming up, I'm very sure that we will be some of the first people to know how the courts are addressing this. Am I right? I mean, we're going to be
certainly
between our three firms. We will probably be some of the first people with clarity on this, and then obviously we will let the people on the group know as soon as we have something.
I think, you know, the most landlords are not going to terminate because of faults that have only arisen in the last 2 weeks of the lockdown, possibly even the whole 5 weeks of the lockdown. So, you know, if we're going to be talking about money claims, those are months away still. If we're talking about people whose right of occupation was terminated because of non-payment now, those are maybe 2 months away at best, maybe a little longer. So the courts are probably not going to be considering these points for a while. But certainly amongst the three of us, the four of us, if we are likely to know early.
Absolutely.
Great. Then while we are talking about force majeure, we have a question from someone on the group. Can force majeure be applicable even though it's not provided for in a specific lease agreement?
Bruno, I think you need to. Yeah. Bruno has done so much research.
So there is a common law, common law element to it. The force majeure clauses in contracts have a specific application that define the actual intervening act and how parties are going to deal with it. In the contract itself, sometimes there's even exclusion clauses, but there's a whole argument that some of these exclusions are against public policy. But again, this is something that we're only going to see when the court decides. If the contract doesn't have, obviously the common law would apply. Common law applies in the sense of a supervening impossibility, so the vis majeure causing the supervening impossibility, and in that instance, a contract that cannot be performed can be terminated. So the argument is that it doesn't have to be in the contract. The common law does make provision for it.
Yeah,
okay,
and the contract can clarify the effects of vis majeure. Yeah. How am I struggling so much to talk today?
Pineapple beer.
Next week, I think next week, Wednesday, guys, instead of talking about law, Greg will host a pineapple beer making show.
Fantastic.
That's another thing I haven't done since the 80s.
Another question we have, so Secunda has Sasol, which has various essential workers in town. Now, they've advised that if they have the necessary work permits, they would be allowed to move without an additional permit to move residential premises. So there is a moving company in town with a permit to move essential workers. This is great, yet where does it leave the agent to do inspections and the handover of keys? Because the agents are not essential workers. So in this respect, what would you advise? Silna, I'm not sure if maybe you want to take this one.
Yeah, that feels like an agent. It feels like an agent question. I'm ready. Yes. So I've been doing quite a lot of training to estate agents, obviously especially over the last few weeks. And my recommendation is, as much as an estate agent, we don't have clarity on whether you guys would be able to function until obviously we know by level 2 you'd be able to function. But there's a lot of things that can be done around the inspection without exposing anybody to risk. If we are thinking about the old ways we've done inspections, everybody goes into the property, the kids are still there, the moving company is there, the dog's there. That's obviously an extremely risky thing to do at this stage. My suggestion is, if somebody is obviously not moving into the property, if somebody is just moving out, leave it for the moment. Nothing's going to happen. It's not like, make sure the geysers and stuff's off and the taps are closed, but nothing's going to change in the property. Take some photos, but everything will be fine. However, before somebody moves in, we're going to have to do an inspection. My opinion is, as much the Rental Housing Act requires this, so as much as the regulations and the National State of Disaster and the Disaster Management Act dictates obviously that the regulations in this situation overrides all other legislation, I cannot see that the intention is to take rights away in a sense where somebody can run into a serious financial loss. So my recommendation is, find a way to do an inspection without being physically present. If you have a very well drafted inspection sheet, send it to the tenant, let the tenant do the inspection, let the tenant then vacate, and you can go in just to check whether the tenant, what he said is the same. Take enough photos. The guys using the software anyway, like Property Inspect, Red Rabbit, those kind of property inspection software, that is ideal. Now is the moment to be using that. Can even send the tenant the details to do the inspection, with the agreement that if there's anything that the tenant accidentally missed, would be then deemed to be the responsibility of the tenant. So it's a practical way that we're going to have to think around it. And I think the most important thing is to keep these arrangements in writing. Guys, please don't pick up the phone, call the tenant and try to arrange an inspection telephonically. That guy's not going to fly. Keep the arrangements in writing between the agent, the landlord, and the tenant. Try to find a middle ground. It's very possible at this stage for the agent to attend to the property without the tenant there to do the inspection and send it to the tenant afterwards to confirm that was the situation. But photos at this stage. Any other suggestions, guys?
Yeah. Nothing.
Rick, you look
sounds
worried.
I'm always worried. No, I completely agree with you. In your practical suggestion, the truth is it demonstrates the Gordian knot of the economy. Everything is interlinked, and this is the problem with government. They're trying to put a line in under certain elements of the economy which are so integrated. I mean, the Brits have found this with Brexit. try and de-integrate an economy and see how far you get, because everything has an implication. And you know, I think the admirable intentions of releasing the lockdown slowly will inevitably lead to those Gordian knots being untied and other threads of the economy that are intrinsic to every other thread having to be permitted. Yeah, this is where we are. I mean, again, it creates an absurdity, and legislation shouldn't do that.
Then another question: is there any sort of obligation on any landlord, body corporate, homeowners association to enforce the regulations of this lockdown? For instance, if there is a tenant who does want to leave the premises, is there anything on the landlord that he has to stop it to enforce this regulation?
I see all our heads shaking.
Everyone's saying no.
No, we've had this conversation. This is why we're laughing. Well, I hope that's why you are laughing, guys. But we've had this conversation, Ronan, and Greg said it nicely. A landlord can't be in a position to police. There might be, like Bruno said earlier, there might be an obligation to report it to authorities. I do think on a body corporate, for instance, there would be an obligation to keep the clubhouse and those kind of shared areas closed. But I don't think the trustees of a body corporate, a landlord, anybody will have to stand there with their gun and make sure people comply. If you are aware that somebody is non-compliant, I do suggest that you then call the authorities to deal with that. But in a situation like a multi-let building with 500 tenants, I mean, what do we expect the landlord to do, to walk around with a gun and pepper spray to enforce? I don't think that's it. If you are aware of a problem, report it, but I don't think anything more than that.
Silna, you've read these very closely. You haven't seen any positive obligation on a civilian person to enforce these measures on a third-party civilian person.
Not at all. It's similar to as much as a random citizen will never be obliged to provide alternative accommodation to another citizen. I think it's on the same level. There is levels of government that has to deal with it.
Yeah. Most legislation is designed to be supported voluntarily by everybody. We know what it's for. We're all abiding by it as best we can. But if my neighbor is up to something, I'm not going to go and make my neighbor enforce the regulations. I think that's wrong.
Absolutely. So, so again, the only time I see that, I entirely agree that there cannot be any positive obligation on any citizen to enforce some law upon somebody else. The only time I see now in these circumstances is in multi-let premises where there's existing tenants there that might be exposed. And I'm not saying shotgun comes out and now you refuse the person entry, but I think in those instances, the problem that you sit with is these other tenants rely on you to kind of control the access into the property, because they themselves can't do anything about an entering tenant that already had the keys and just came in and opened the door. So I think in those circumstances, there may be, I'm reluctant to call it an obligation, but I would strongly suggest that the landlord actually call the authorities to report an incidence of somebody traveling and coming into the premises and possibly compromising or contaminating the premises.
Look, access is a different story. We were talking about exit. Can you
fair
prevent
enough,
someone leaving? Are you a jailer?
Yeah, no.
I don't think
no,
you are.
Absolutely not. No.
Access,
Yeah.
obviously, to a multi-let, that may be different, and I certainly agree with you. But somebody leaving, you got to stand there and stop them. I don't think so.
No, absolutely.
Just tell them to wear a mask and smile.
Yeah.
And then lastly, last week we spoke about the moratorium on evictions. And obviously now, since with level 4 and everything that's going on, what is your stance on this? Is this just another one of those we're going to have to wait and see the regulations from the government? And at this stage right now, we don't actually have any advice in this respect.
Well, the truth is that the questions we are dealing with now are the questions that have to be regulated before one can think of evicting someone. Until some measure of freedom of movement is permissible at whatever level that may take place, it's going to be difficult to evict. Relocation is a different story. You see the state is relocating people every day right now, either by way of de-densifying residents, or let's say RDP housing becomes available. People, they will obviously move the beneficiaries into that housing. It prevents it being invaded and other reasons. So, the public good is served in some instances by people moving around. So I think, a relocation is a different story. So if you're talking about evicting someone that's of the poorer demographic, in terms of an order, in terms of which temporary emergency accommodation has to be provided, I don't see any reason why that can't happen. But a conventional eviction, in the same way as a warrant of execution can't be executed now, that will come with greater freedom of movement.
Rowan, but I think what's very important to appreciate here is landlords, the fact that we have a moratorium on evictions for the moment doesn't mean it gives the tenant a right to not pay his rent. I think that's an extremely crucial distinction. The fact that the government is very nice to everybody to say just sit where you are, even if somebody had his lease agreement was terminated, or before lockdown even he was placed on terms, or during lockdown. I mean, we've had more than 20 business days in lockdown. I think I haven't counted, but my calculations is my closest to as an attorney can go without a calculator. So I think when somebody gets to an end of a lease agreement, be it cancellation or termination, and he is still in the property, he's not allowed to move because the regulations doesn't allow him. There's a moratorium on evictions. The fact that that lease agreement isn't in place anymore doesn't mean the person can stay for free. He's still responsible for holding over damages, which is exactly the same amount as the rent. We can call it different things, loss of income, holding over damages will still be due and payable, and the tenant that's currently, or the occupant that's currently not a tenant and doesn't have a lease agreement, but that can't move and we can't evict him, it's very important to appreciate that they are still liable for a monthly payment in the same amount as the rent would have been.
Okay, fantastic. Do you guys have any more comments that you want to say? We've unfortunately reached the end of our second Wednesday workshop. All good. Fantastic.
Yeah,
it was good.
Great.
It was good to be with you. I can't wait for the beer webinar next week.
Looking forward to that one as well. Recording.
I think we're looking forward to the. Sorry, Rowan. We're looking forward to the progressive and fast relaxation of the economy in circumstances that we've all learned stuff. None of us have ever taken steps not to get flu or a cold before. We now know how to take those steps, and we will continue to do so, which will enable the economy to progressively be unlocked as soon as possible while we take these steps.
Absolutely. And with the release of the the release of the regulations tomorrow, we will probably try and make some sort of plan to get information out to all the viewers and members of the group. We haven't discussed how yet, but there will be definitely something going out just to kind of clarify what the position might be, because there will still be a level of interpretation needed. I doubt it's going to be as precise as we all wish it would be. Yeah, and then as we go along through the first couple of days, I can imagine there is going to need to be a lot of interaction and information getting out there. So yeah, we'll definitely be active.
Yes, I'm glad you said that, Bruno, because I think it's important. I think everybody's noticed on the group and on the page, we're pretty quiet. It's not because we don't want to talk to you. It's just as long as we don't have something actual, concrete that will add value to your life, we're not just going to bombard you with boring things. But if there's something, we will definitely let you know. And thank you for the questions that you guys posted during the week. I think you saw that we did address that, so keep those coming. But for the moment, if we don't talk to you, it's just because there's really nothing to say. And so I don't know if no news is good news in this situation. I think no news at this stage is just no news.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
well,
guys.
anybody who wants any more questions, please comment, post, let us know, and then we will see you all in our next Wednesday workshop next week. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank
Thanks very
you,
much.
guys.
Thank you, Rowan.
Bye-bye.